In early February of 2007, we caught up with the new National Hurricane Center Director, Bill Proenza, and Bill spent about an hour on the broadcast, Weather in the Media show, discussing the challenges ahead at running the National Hurricane Center. Here's the interview. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have Bill Proenza on the phone from the new National Hurricane Center Director, and probably the best-dressed man at NOAA that I've seen in all the years going to the conferences and whatnot. Bill is now taking over the National Hurricane Center. And, Bill, I hope I'm not going to be too hard on you here tonight because I got a ton of questions, and I know you probably are limited for time, but I hope I'm not too tough on you with some of these questions, but they're questions that a lot of people that listen to these broadcasts and use Hurricane City, these are hurricane fanatics and people that know a little bit more than the general public knows, and they might want to, ask some questions that are more in the operational aspects of the Hurricane Center and weather patterns and whatnot. So I hope we're not too hard on you by the time this is over with. But again, I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, Jim, it's a pleasure to do so, and I look forward to the questions. And of course, I appreciate the interest that you have out there in your listening public as well. We have a partnership going with the public, of course, and they're very important in our effectiveness in making sure that the warnings do get out and the proper response comes back from the public when it comes to a warning hitting the area.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where your job. There's a lot of pressure in the job you have because, that was going to be my first question. Actually, is it seems like all the directors, if you go back to the Gordon Dunn, the first director of the National Hurricane Center, and you average out all the years that they've stayed at the Hurricane Center, it averages to 5 years per director. And I know Neil Frank stayed for like 13 years, and a couple other guys stayed a little longer than 5 years, but it averages out to 5 years. Do you think this is because of the politics of running the National Hurricane Center, or is it more because of the stress related to covering hurricanes and what it means to be accurate?
Well, I think it's a lot to do with the stress, and certainly there's no doubt that there are politics involved in making sure that we do everything we can to not only provide the best possible forecast, but in addition to gain the support that we need so that we can build the technology and science infusion that we need to get better in the future. And that's always a challenge because, as you know, when it comes to the allocation of the tax dollar, it doesn't get any easier with time.
Right, and then we had the report coming out about the NOAA cuts for the planes, for the research aircraft going into the hurricanes. Can you tell us a little about what happened there?
Well, first of all, most of your listeners, of course, know that we fly P3 hurricane hunters into these hurricanes and tropical storms, areas that indicate that there's some activity developing, depressions, tropical depressions, and so forth. And at the same time, we partner that effort with the U.S. Air Force, and they, in turn, will fly these C-130s in there. But in any case, the P3s that we have from the NOAA and National Weather Service usually have about 120 days of flying time available for a particular hurricane season. Sometimes we can increase that if a hurricane season gets a little bit more active than normal, and we need to plan accordingly, and we need to make sure that those resources are available to us. They're vitally important to all of us, especially when we're monitoring these storms out over the ocean where we don't have too much in the way of information coming back to us. We certainly have the pictures and the remote sensing from the satellites, but we also need the data from within the storm. So these are important to us. There have been several concerns expressed that the number of flights may be limited, although we're still hanging in there. Money is very, very tight for us this year. Indeed, NOAA and the National Weather Service, of which the National Hurricane Center is part of, has experienced what we call in the budget process a continuing resolution. It's a budget year that's based on last year's level of budget support. And, of course, with inflation, when we have a year that comes after a previous year, we know that even though we may be getting the same amount of money, we'll have less money to work with in reality to get the same job done.
Well, now you would think that they would give you a little more funding based on the whole Hurricane Katrina disaster and the attention that hurricanes have gotten over the last few years. Do you think it's not increased proportionately because of the terrorists, the money going to the fighting terrorism, or do you think that this is just business as usual?
I think as far as the hurricane program, our National Hurricane Warning Program, which is a combined effort of not only the National Hurricane Center, but also the National Weather Service's weather forecast offices and river forecast centers all around the coastal areas across the nation. But in addition to that, we have other sections of NOAA that contribute towards the effort. For example, NESDIS, they're vital in providing the satellite information to us and the data archiving for the further studies into the future. And then there's the research side of the NOAA organization that we work very closely with. For example, the Hurricane Research Division that's out here at Key Biscayne, just southeast of Miami. And they're also part of the research effort that we work with, and we kind of pool our resources together to do the best we can. But yet, when you look at the amount of dollars that we're being given over the last several years, in spite of what has been a very active period of hurricane and tropical storm development, I'm seeing our budget actually be cut back. Just recently, as far as we have what's called a joint hurricane test bed, where we're taking some of the science and technology, and in a span of 1 to 2 years, we're adapting that to make it part of our operations, to support operations, to improve our models and our forecasting. And yet the money for that particular aspect of our research and actually translation into operation has been pulled away. We're down by $500,000 out of a budget that started at $1,500,000  3-4 years ago. So we're heading in the wrong direction. And in addition to that, I have another $200,000 of support funding that particular part of our operation requires that I'm just simply not getting funded. So we're, in spite of what's happened, as far as the bottom line research dollar is concerned, we're having that pulled back. On the other hand, on a little bit of a positive note, we have 4 additional hurricane specialists that have been granted to the National Weather Service for the National Hurricane Center. And we have brought those people on board, and we're very glad to have these hurricane specialists. They're vital to making sure that we have a little bit more depth to the capability we have to handle these storms 24/7 when the season gets active.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned about the 4 additional forecasters. That was going to be one of the questions I had, and you don't really have to answer this with great detail, but just a general ballpark figure. If a kid's going to college and they want to become a forecaster and work at the National Hurricane Center, what kind of money can be made working at the Hurricane Center? What kind of salaries are they equivalent to working at the National Hurricane? Or is that a higher level of pay at the Hurricane Center compared to other branches of NOAA?
Actually, they all pretty much follow a certain pattern depending on responsibility and the type of job that they have from the standpoint of if they are watching overall all the products of an office going out, they become a senior hurricane specialist, and they're responsible for all of the forecasts and warnings that go out from a program. Likewise, in the forecast office, we have senior forecasters who do the same thing for air, land, and sea, all of the forecasts and warnings that are issued by them over land. The National Hurricane Center, of course, concentrates its efforts out over the ocean where there are no other offices. And what we do is we monitor and track the storms and apply the science into the forecasting. And then at the same time, then as these storms approach land, then we're issuing watches and eventual warnings. Mm-hmm. And that's the responsibility. And we sort of have a handoff to the local forecast offices as these storms approach landfall, and they pick up the responsibility from there. Back to the original question as to the pay will start out for a meteorological intern that comes out of college and has either a bachelor's or master's degree, and they would be making anywhere from about $35,000 to $45,000 a year. And then from there, they expand gradually into journeyman level forecast position that runs upward to $75,000. And then when you get into the senior forecast status, then you begin to make anywhere from $75,000 to as much as about $110,000, as most of the senior people will find themselves in. And it'll be a gradual process, a longer time, and the improved performance of an employee contributes towards how fast the subsequent pay raises occur.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting. That's pretty good pay when you stick around for a while, I guess. Now, as far as your job, now you were the director of the southern region of NOAA, based out of Fort Worth, Texas. Is this, I know it's kind of a weird question, but is this, when you take the director of the National Hurricane Center job, is the boss, is the new guy that's the southern director your boss, or what is the chain of command at NOAA? I mean, are you still above the person that's the southern director, or how does that work?
Be glad to explain that to you. At one time, the director of the southern region of the National Weather Service, which covered 1/4 of the nation and about 1,000 employees from New Mexico across Oklahoma and Texas, all the way eastward through Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands out into the Caribbean, about 20% of the entire National Weather. At one time, they were the supervisor for the National Hurricane Center director. But back in the early 80s, late 70s, that was switched over to being a position that was supervised from Washington, from the national headquarters in Washington. And when that happened, both positions are at the same level. They're both director positions, and the pay is comparable. So it is considered, for example, when I took the job, I was headquartered in Fort Worth and traveled across the southern U.S. and was responsible for weather services across the southern U.S. When I took the job on for the National Hurricane Center, I essentially moved laterally into that job with no paid promotion, incidentally, but it is we look at it as a wonderful opportunity to continue the service to the nation. And as I mentioned in some earlier discussions, that I feel that there's no higher calling than for government service than the protection of its citizens. Right. And we value that opportunity tremendously.
Yeah, that's a heck of a responsibility, being the director of the National Hurricane Center. But I have to ask you, are you going to be the one in front of the camera this year at the National Hurricane Center doing the updates?
Yes, I will be. However, I wish I could tell you that we could look ahead and see a hurricane season that would more parallel last year. But as things stand right now, we're awaiting all of the factors that are going to contribute towards that outlook to come out and probably be evaluated by sometime in the 3rd or 4th week of May. But as things stand at this time, it does look for a return to a more active season as we look at the first early factors. But we're going to have to wait till May to get the final outlook. Okay.
I have one more question, then if you don't mind, we can open up the phone lines. I know there's probably some people out there that want to ask you some questions, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay, now the...
And incidentally, Jim, I have as much time as you need. This is important, and I appreciate the opportunity we have here to have an open line.
I appreciate that, too. This is something that happened during Max Mayfield's tenure down at the Hurricane Center, and I don't think that he had anything to do with it, but I was curious as to why, like when Hurricane Wilma hit here, the weather observations that I measure here at my location, I have a 40-foot unobstructed tower with weather observations, weather instruments up there, and I turn it in on the automated internet service that allows you to get the observations online during a hurricane.
Sure.
And for the life of me, I can't understand how it doesn't show up on the reports, even the unofficial reports sometimes, when I'm giving them detailed wind, barometer, wind direction, wind gust, all those types of things. And then I've even gone as far as to email some of the guys at the Hurricane Center after I haven't seen anything results from the form to give them personal observations of what happened here. I don't run on with long emails, but I just give them a basic, real quick rundown of what happened. And then I even called the Miami Weather Service office, which is located in the same building, to report to them what I was observing here during Wilma, because the eye came right over and I was measuring everything, 957 millibars, and it didn't show up in the unofficial reports. And also the second part of this question is, what does one have to do to become an official weather observer?
Okay, first of all, we really do appreciate those types of observations, and we appreciate the effort that you put forward, Jim, in trying to get those observations to us. Sometimes there's so many observations coming in that we can't get back to all of the observations as they're sent to us. But you should have received really some response back in appreciation for what you were able to send in. I know that the forecast office certainly appreciates those observations, and the hurricane specialists as well. Mm-hmm. Those are valuable real-time bits of data coming in. And if someone says that they may be unofficial because they don't exactly meet the standards of the official observation towers that we have across the nation, that doesn't mean that they're not providing us some very important information. And so I would encourage that type of information coming towards us, and certainly an email is a very efficient way to get that to us. And I would be surprised that your information was not used. I'm sure it was valuable information, including the pressure that you read in the storm passage, but of course the wind. The winds that were reported as well. And as you know, as Wilma moved across the area, the damage it caused, especially when it hit some areas that hadn't been hit for quite a while by a tropical storm or a hurricane, indicated to us that indeed Wilma was a significant storm.
Right, but it wasn't a major hurricane, and I've had discussions with some of the neighbors about the winds, because I measured about 89 miles an hour here in Delray Beach, and the eye passed directly overhead, and the only problem might have been one of the guide wires snapped on the tower, and it might have bumped into the cups a couple of times during the high wind gust, but I'm convinced that there wasn't anything over 100 miles an hour at my home, but it still did a heck of a lot of damage. And this leads me to believe that when a major hurricane comes into South Florida here, that I don't know what's going to happen here, because the amount of damage that Wilma did was substantial here, even though we cleaned up the mess pretty quick. Category 4 or 5, can you tell people out there listening what the difference is between like a Wilma and a bona fide Cat 4 or 5?
I surely can. And in fact, first of all, I have to tell you, Wilma was a significant storm, and it was easily into a solid Category 2 hurricane area, because the winds that you recorded, plus the fact that that particular range, as far as a Category 2 hurricane is concerned, has winds in it from 96 to 110 miles per hour. That's 1 minute sustained winds. And that's a very significant wind. When you consider that's a sustained wind, you can have higher gusts. You can have higher gusts in that. Then when you get into your major hurricanes, a Category 3 and higher, then you've got winds of anywhere from 111 to 130 miles an hour, 1 minute minimum sustained winds. And again, judging by the impact that Wilma had in the area, we know how significant that can be. And certainly those people that experienced Hurricane Andrew in South Dade can certainly attest to that in 1992 and what that was like for them when we had a Category 5 hurricane with tremendous winds hitting South Dade. And of course, the history certainly denotes that it was a very, very significant hurricane, just simply from the standpoint of the amount of damage that Hurricane Andrew caused this area. And it was lingering. It was tremendous damage that, as we all know, it took quite a few years to completely get back from.
Yeah, I know that you've flown in many hurricanes in your earlier years with NOAA, and flying in with the hurricane hunters. Also, how many have you been in any on the ground, actually in like a structure or in where a hurricane was hitting you directly?
Yes. First of all, let me answer the first one. In the Hurricane Hunters, I went into 21 storms back in the late 60s. But as far as being on the ground, I was in Hurricane Cleo in 1964 and on duty, in fact, at the National Hurricane Center. At that time, it was the last year where it was actually located on the 27th Avenue location, what was called the Aviation Building. One of the first locations of the National Hurricane Center, a location where when we were there, Gordon E. Dunn was the director, and Neil Frank was a budding forecaster coming up through the ranks and already impressing many of us with his capabilities. I was later to go to school with Neil, and he was certainly top-notch. But looking back at that time, I was experienced Cleo there, and then earlier when I was just a youngster in the area, I also experienced Donna in 1960. Looking at it from the standpoint of experiences, too, on the ground after the hurricanes, I was actually in the official survey team for Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and at a time when we started to fly down into this area and review the damage and check the reports and evaluate the wind the wind destruction and so forth, we were the only way that we could get around was by helicopter, and that was the case, as many South Floridians will remember, when you could not negotiate through the highways as they were blocked with so much debris.
What a mess. That was just an absolute... It was so I couldn't believe it when I was down there looking at that. That wind could do all that damage, and it's just like a major tornado hitting is what it looked like.
Yes, and then Hurricane Katrina, being the director of the director of the southern region of the National Weather Service, I was down with my folks in the New Orleans area within a day and a half after the storm struck, and incidentally, those people were on duty 24/7 continuously through the hurricane and through the aftermath of the hurricane and the harsh impact that it had in that particular area.
All right. Now, I have to get to this question because I know that you're probably bracing for it anyways, but you're going to get asked a lot in the media over the next several years, and that's this ongoing global warming debate about what impact it's going to have on the planet and the hurricane season. And I wanted to know your opinion because I know Max Mayfield pretty much made his opinions known on the subject of how it's going to relate to hurricane seasons. What's your stance on the global warming affecting hurricane seasons in the future? What do you see happening here, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I certainly feel that it would be a logical conclusion that global warming would have some effect on hurricane and tropical storm development. But it is more important how much of an effect that concerns us in the field. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's certain factors that we deal with that are major impacts on the number of tropical storms and hurricanes. Some of these factors are, one of them is the multi-decadal cycle that we have been able to identify over the years and years as we look at the trend line of the number of storms averaged out over 5-year increments and back through the years. We've been able to denote that at certain times we'll have several decades where we'll have above normal, above average, I should say, is better put, above average numbers of tropical storms and hurricanes. We started one such period in 1995. Let's just keep that in mind for a moment. Then there's another factor here. Here we had 04 and 05 as very, very active seasons, significantly active seasons. One in 04 for Florida because we had 4 major hurricanes in one way or another strike and impact the state of Florida. And then, of course, in 05, just by the sheer number of storms and then such devastating storms as Katrina, a storm whose impact was aggravated by the fact, of course, that New Orleans is below sea level, and it sure made that impact even worse yet, and there's no question about that. But nevertheless, 05 was a very, very active hurricane season, and it had a record number of named storms. As some of us may recall, it was more than the numbers we had in 1933. Now, there may have been a lot of storms in 33 that we missed on and that we didn't know were out there in the middle of the ocean. But even so, we do know that no matter what, 2005 was a record-breaking year and one that would certainly be comparable to 1933, if not certainly stronger than 33. Having said that, we went through two very active seasons, and then in 06, it was a very interesting year indeed. All the factors pointed to a very active season. For example, we knew that sea surface temperatures are very warm, and we knew that the conditions across the Gulf and the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic, all the berthing areas for the tropical storms and hurricanes, were just right to begin the development of another active season. But it's interesting to note that as the season began, we started to develop more and more of an El Nino effect. So in spite of the fact that we were in a multi-decadal period of active tropical storms and hurricanes, in spite of the fact that we had sea surface temperatures, the second warmest year of sea surface temperatures, again across the berthing areas of the Western Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico, in spite of that, we still had a factor that played in even more strongly, and subsiding winds that fought convection, and of course the shearing winds that fight the tropical storm and hurricane development that could have occurred, and all of those prompted by El Nino and maybe some other effects that we yet have been able to identify, that there's much research yet to be done. So we look at that, and we see that even in the spite of, in the midst of a active period of decadal period of hurricane and tropical storm development, a period of warm sea surface temperatures and global warming, that there are other factors that are even stronger yet that can impact our hurricane season.
Well, now I'm not a professional stat keeper on hurricanes by any stretch of the imagination, but I did go back and look over a 100-year period here, and I know the first 50 years we can pretty much discount because of the fact that we didn't have satellites, we didn't have the hurricane hunters out there, so we missed a lot of storms. But
a good point, Jim.
Yeah, but if you look at since 1995, as you mentioned in the beginning of this question, that's when things really got kicked off. And if you look at all the years since 1995, including last year, all of these seasons had double-digit named storms, except for 1997, right, which was an El Nino year. Going back in history, all the other years, there's never been anything close to this. Even since satellites have been up, since the 60s, we have not seen any seasons, more than a few seasons in a row with double-digit named storms until the last decade, where it's just been phenomenal, the amount of storms. And not only that, but the average wind speed is about 5 miles an hour stronger this last decade on all the storms combined as well. So this leads me to my question about global warming. I know Chris Lancy has made it public that, from the statement from the National Hurricane Center, that they believe that this is just a cyclical pattern, that we're going to go back to slower seasons, maybe 30 years from now. But looking at this trend, it's a little bit unnerving when you see these kind of numbers over the last 10 years. If it wasn't for the El Ninos, we'd really be having a lot of storms. Do you really believe that we're going to go down in 30 years, or are you going to kind of play the neutral on this and say, well, we really don't know? Or what's your stance personally on it?
Well, you brought up some very good observations, Jim. One, that wind speeds have been upwards to maybe 5 miles an hour higher on average over the storms that we've had over this period. That indeed we've had double-digit storms in almost every year except for 97. 2006 was just barely getting into the 10 storms, so they barely made it into a double digit. But nevertheless, it was there. And, of course, the fact is that we've had all this activity, and now we're looking at the impact of it all and saying, how much is global warming contributing to the aggravation, to the number of storms we have, to the intensity of these storms? Mm-hmm. And even if we look at percentage, like you were saying, 5 miles an hour, which in the typical 125-mile-an-hour storm, 150-mile-an-hour storm, the stronger storms, that would mean a increase in intensity of anywhere from 2, 3, 5%.
Okay. Do we have a caller on the line?
Yes, we do.
Bill, are you still there?
I'm certainly here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I pushed the button for a caller. We have I didn't even explain this to you, Bill. On the live broadcast, it's actually like a video screen, and we're showing pictures of you while you're talking, and in between I put the toll-free number up. I just put it up a few minutes ago, so we're going to start getting callers here. So I think we do have a caller on the line. Go ahead, caller.
Hi, Jim and Bill. This is Tony Mondero up in Harrison, New Jersey. And, Bill, I have a question for you. And it has to do with the weather and the media. And I believe we lost our greatest advocate a few years ago in John Hope of the National Hurricane Center. He used to be a forecaster there and then went to the Weather Channel as a hurricane specialist for them. But my question to you, Bill, what do you think about the major news outlets, cable outlets like CNN, MSNBC, Fox? They seem during the heat of the battle when we're tracking hurricanes or moving to the U.S. coastline, that they all seem, especially AccuWeather with Joe Pistardi, that they all have a different tilt or slant on what the hurricane is supposed to do or what the Hurricane Center is saying. And my biggest question is, I thought we were all trained within the emergency management and also the TV media to talk to the public in one voice. And I see over the years now we're getting away from that. And I'm going to drop the line and let other callers get in.
That's a great
question.
Thank
you very much, and good luck to you, Bill.
And Tony, thank you so much for your question.
No problem.
Thanks, Tony.
A good question, in fact, and one which is very important to all of us because the consistency of the message is important in making sure that we have a response from the public that is effective. And by and large, I really feel that the media is a very strong partner to the effectiveness of our National Hurricane Warning Program, and I'll tell you how. The very fact that they cover the events actively and indeed are able to convey to the public at large that these storms are occurring, they're making landfall, as the case may be, and when people see that, it adds enough credibility to what's going on that I think it increases the response and makes the response more effective on the part of the public at large. And that's what it's all about. We're trying to, as much as possible, provide the very, very best forecasts and warnings out there, and then hopefully get them to respond properly to those hurricane tropical storm warnings that are issued. The best of them, the best forecast is for naught if we can't get that proper response. So the media certainly adds a lot of credibility to what is going on. But on the other hand, when we have the occasional, which I believe is not as frequent as we may sometimes feel it is, response from the media at large that indeed they feel that possibly a hurricane is not going to impact a certain area, and that particular area is free of any significant impact from that storm. I believe that can be sometimes undermining the responses that we need from that particular arena. But I believe that that's a rarity more than that is the rule these days. And I think that many of the people that we work with are very, very supportive of what we're trying to do, and they do everything they can to make sure that they portray the very latest information to the public as the Center of Excellence that we have with the Hurricane Specialist Unit here at the Hurricane Center decides what their forecast to be. Another partner that's very important to us is the emergency management community. That is not only the emergency managers that have the expertise to know what to do when a storm threatens an area and have done the planning, the preparedness activities and so forth for an area to know how much evacuation should be needed, if any at all, but also they're very effective in working with the local government officials and making sure that we have all of the legal authorities in place to make the whatever actions that we need to take effective as well. And I think that partnership of the media, emergency management, and working together is one that really helps us deliver a very effective mission of protecting life.
Right.
Again, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I said again, it would be desirable that we have more consistency sometimes, but we've got to let that play out. I really defend the right of some organizations to go out and say that they may feel that the forecast may be a little bit too strong, or possibly on the other side not strong enough. Let's just see what additional information that can provide in effectiveness. In reality, there usually, when there might be an explanation that's given that may not be quite consistent with the forecast, it's usually not that far off, that we're not still working towards the same effective outcome. So we hope that we can continue that partnership also with the private meteorological sector that has been so supportive, and in turn we have been so supportive of as well.
Well, let me ask you this, Bill. In the event that, and I think I know what Tony was driving at in his question. Oh, we got another caller here. Let me put this caller through. Go ahead, caller.
Hi, it's Weather Girl.
Weather Girl Nancy is calling in from Destin, Florida, in the Panhandle. Good evening, Nancy.
Hi, Jim. How you doing?
Good.
Good.
Good evening, Nancy.
Hello, Bill. How are you? It's great to meet you, at least over the internet.
Yes, my pleasure, Nancy.
Yes. My question, Bill, is you were touching briefly on the global warming issue and the effect on the season. What effect do you feel there may be for this season now that the El Nino has backed off earlier than predicted?
Very good question, Nancy. And I think that once El Nino, the waning effects of El Nino on our hurricane tropical storm season would be to be going back towards an active decadal period as we have started back in 1995, a period that I think would be with us for at least 20 to 30 years. However, as far as going back to the impact of the global warming, we have a gentleman on our staff, a scientist named Chris Lancy, that has done some very, very insightful research into what the impact would be from global warming, expecting the sea surface temperatures to be affected by a certain percentage due to global warming. And again, as Jim mentioned earlier, we feel that on average that the strength of hurricanes and tropical storms can be impacted to the extent that they'll be somewhat stronger, a few percentage points stronger, anywhere up to about 5 miles an hour has been what we have been observing on average. And at the same time, every couple of years, when you consider that same percentage increase of activity, we may have a few more storms that may be occurring. On the other hand, there has been one theory that has been expounded, that the storms that we have may be stronger, may be more effective in distributing the uneven heat energy that is brought to the surface of the earth that generates these storms. And since we have a few storms that may be more effective and stronger in dispensing that unequal heating, that indeed, over the long run, we may have fewer storms, but they may be stronger. So we're going to, and what I'm trying to say here, I'm trying to share with you the scientific community's attempts to try to get a handle on what the impact will be. But the jury is still out on all of the impacts from this. And it's like going back to all of the factors that are working on hurricanes and tropical storms. What are the factors that are influencing the number of hurricanes and tropical storms in the season? And while we know about El Nino and the multi-decadal active areas and the sea surface temperatures and so forth, we don't have all the factors. There are other factors that we have to consider in there, of which global warming has got to be one of the contributors. And how much of an impact overall that's going to have, we need to do some further studies. But in the meantime, I think that we've got our work cut out nevertheless, making sure that we are as prepared as we can be, and that we enlist as much as we can the involvement of the public at large to join us in a partnership, and in a partnership that I think is absolutely vital to the protection of life. And that is that indeed we need to prepare ahead of time before the season starts.
Yeah,
whatever we need to do.
I know that's probably what your sticking point is with when you say publicly to people you need to start preparing. They're probably thinking, well, it's the same old speech. But at the same time, you don't want to alarm people and have them thinking that every hurricane is going to be a Cat 4 or 5. But you're also looking at the increased hurricane activity we're currently experiencing and the warmer sea surface temperatures. You know, when I'm looking at those SST maps, when there's a hurricane out there, I'm thinking, oh my God, if it gets into those 86-degree waters and it has upper level support, this thing's going to blow up.
That's right, Nancy.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
yeah, that's what she. You know, I with her question, you know, being up in the northern Gulf there, they've had their share of pretty significant hurricanes. You know, Katrina, one of them coming up in there. But is it, you know, it's fair to say that we could see stronger hurricanes than what we've even been seeing the last few years go up into the northern Gulf and other areas. So I know.
Well, Jim, that's what I'm trying to tell everybody up here. I'm already fighting complacency because it was so quiet last year. People are more than willing to fall into that pattern of it's not going to happen again. And as part of the CERT team and the Red Cross volunteering I'm doing, we're trying to get that message back out again, that it's
And
we were
Nancy,
lucky
we
last year.
appreciate your efforts, and Jim, as he well stated there, what we're facing is as we look at the new seasons. But there are other factors, too, now that we're facing even more than ever before. Right now, the population of the United States, within the first 50 miles of the coast, we see 50% of the entire U.S. population. 50%. There is a very attractive force that's bringing people more and more in greater numbers to the coast. People that have not experienced hurricanes and tropical storms, the people that we need to outreach for and make sure that they know what they're doing when the time comes. And the only way to do that is to make sure we enlist them, as many as we can, in this idea that they've got to be giving it some thought. They, their families, their businesses, some thought to what are they going to do if a hurricane threatens the area. And they've got to do that before the hurricane season starts.
Right.
That's the message, and I'm sorry if it sounds like we're repeating it over and over again, but as you know, any of us that are working with emergency managers will tell you, there are so many new people at the coast. We've got to continue to emphasize that point. And whether or not the season's active or below active, whether or not it's a 1992 season where the A storm didn't show up until the end of August, and that was Andrew.
Right.
We know that it all takes one storm
That's right.
to make a terrible season.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for your time, and thank you, Jim, and
Okay.
we're enjoying the show.
Well, you know, Nancy is thinking about coming down for the conference here, Bill, so you might get a chance to meet Nancy.
Yes, absolutely.
Nancy, I look forward to it.
Look forward to it, too. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Talk
I
to
much
you.
appreciate your call.
You know, another thing, Bill, the storm surge. You know, people. Well, not only the storm surge potential, but I run into so many people that have been brushed by hurricanes, and they think, well, that wasn't any big deal. Can you explain the difference between a brush and a hit? Something that's 60 miles away versus something that comes right over you?
Oh, certainly, and this is one of the big concerns that we all have. A hurricane, obviously, we see it on a map sometimes as a center of a hurricane itself, the eye and the eye wall, and indeed, that may be, an eye can be anywhere from 30 to 50 miles across, and then the eye wall itself is the strongest source of wind sometimes, is right in from the eye, and that can be another 20 miles or so on either side of that eye. So we're looking at an area that may be anywhere from 50 to 80, 90 miles across that would have the very strongest winds. But we know that a hurricane will impact an area sometimes 200 to 300 miles across. And people who experience it with a lot less wind than a hurricane or than the worst of the hurricane. And the feeling is, gee, I survived Katrina and I was 80 miles away and it wasn't that bad for us. Therefore, the next storm that comes along, I feel I can survive it. And yet that next storm may bring the eye right over them.
And it could be a smaller storm and be more devastating for them.
It could be another Hurricane Andrew, which was a relatively small storm, and yet, folks, it was a Category 5 hurricane. That means winds, 1 minute sustained winds, were greater than 155 miles an hour. a tremendously devastating storm.
All right, we got an email question here from Fred up in Long Island. During hurricanes, how many people work together to get the forecast track and intensity of the storm, and how many hours do you put in when a storm is a threat to land?
Very good question. I can give you a handle on some of the reaction that we have when we look at the number of hours that we put in over what's normal, and maybe that can help answer the question. First of all, in the Hurricane Center, we have about 48 people as part of the team. But it isn't a Hurricane Center only that's working the storm, and of course we're working 24/7, and we're never closed. But let's just look, for example, at the support for the Hurricane Center. The support can come from the U.S. Air Force in their Hurricane Hunters, and it can also come from the NOAA Aircraft Operations Center, which can also have their planes into these storms. And when they do that, these planes can carry about a dozen people into the storms. So we have to consider that. In addition to that, there's a lot of research that goes into these storms, and we have a research community that involves not only NOAA, but also the Air Force and the Navy and the U.S. For example, the many schools of meteorology across the nation have many activities and research programs working right now into the hurricane and tropical storm problem. And all that is contributed towards the greater good of understanding the hurricane threat better and being able to forecast the hurricane with more accuracy and track it with more accuracy. So that's a factor that plays in there. And then once the hurricane begins to make landfall, then all of the fine resolution pictures that we're getting, the radar pictures, all of those radars are 10-centimeter top of the science type of and technology radar that's available for weather monitoring and research, and those are provided and monitored by another part of the National Weather Service, the Weather Forecast Offices, and we have them all across the coastal areas, down from New England, across the southeast part of the country, and up and around into the Gulf of Mexico, and then of course we also have them out into the Caribbean as well, for example in the San Juan area that monitors the Virgin Islands and the Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic area. So we have all of these radars, and then in addition, that once they start to make landfall, then it is the National Weather Service forecast offices that are issuing the surge calculations for their area with the local expertise they bring to the table, and they have local insights into what areas are more greatly impacted because of terrain, features, and that sort of thing. That is a factor in determining how a particular spot along a coastal area may react to a storm coming in with a certain direction and approach. In addition to that, it is the National Weather Service forecast offices that are issuing the tornado warnings. They issue the flash flood watches and eventually the flash flood warnings. They're also issuing all sorts of forecasts and impact statements, air, land, and sea, not only out over the recreational boating areas, but also inland and above the ground for the aviation community, because all of the aviation forecasting also comes from the National Weather Service. And the impact of these hurricanes is, of course, being felt in air, land, and sea in all categories. So they're also involved with that. Now, looking back at 04 and 05, we had some active seasons then, of course, and when we look back at the number of overtime hours towards the end of our management finance year, we can kind of determine just how many more hours were spent handling these storms. But we had over 7,000 hours in 04 overtime hours. That's when people work beyond the 8 hours and continue to work. And then in 05, we had 7,500 hours of overtime that was recorded by, and I'm just looking at the southern region of the National Weather Service to show you what the impact would be. Add to that the amount of hours that were put in by the Hurricane Center, and we've got really an enormous amount of effort and a lot of people working together. And then we can't get the job done by ourselves. We have a tremendous partnership with emergency management and with the media as well. They're all working together, and then we have the response and recovery people like the Red Cross and the Army Corps, everybody pulling together, local organizations that are out there contributing their time and effort to bring food and water to the people that are impacted. So it's quite an impact. FEMA is also very active and has been very responsible, though they're not a first responder as we would normally have. That's usually the local area, the fire departments, the police departments, the emergency management community are your first responders.
Mm-hmm. Bill, kind of changing gears a little bit here, I forgot to ask you when the caller called up about the, by the way, that toll-free number, 888-372-8890. The phone is open. The caller, Tony, up there was asking about AccuWeather, and that was going to be one of my questions. Do you go to the private hurricane sites out there and weather sites and surf around just for fun when you're not? And what do you do when you're not tracking hurricanes? Do you have any hobbies and interests? But what do you do when you're online as far as going to hurricane sites and things like that?
That's a very good question, and I'm usually so busy, even in the off season. Let me explain. When this position was announced that I had been selected for it, it was the 1st of December, and then it was announced at the National Press Club in Washington on November the 5th or the 6th, I forget right now. But in any case, I was on duty on January 3rd, and I have been very, very active in making sure that I meet with emergency management groups, with media groups, anywhere where we have an opportunity to outreach, to work together with partners, public groups, emergency management officials, as well as local government officials, making sure that we're together, we're connected. The local forecast offices are very important towards that effort because they do a lot of preparedness work before the season starts. But right now, my time is being filled up tremendously in hurricane awareness tours, as well as speaking engagements all up and down the East Coast and over into the Gulf of Mexico as well, and even, in fact, into the Caribbean. In a couple of weeks, I will be going to a meeting in Curacao where the World Meteorological Organization, the Subcommittee on Hurricanes, will be meeting, of which I chair. And we'll be involved there, making sure that we're coordinating all of our tropical cyclone forecast efforts among all the nations involved in a manner that most effectively gets the information out to the people that need to know it. And so we work together as the United Nations group would normally work together in a very positive way. So we're involved with that as well. So the effort continues very, very actively, and then once June 1st rolls around, then I pull back on the number of trips that I'm making and speaking engagements, and I start to concentrate more on being there as we monitor the season and being ready to begin the dissemination process of getting the information out to the public at large, to our partners, and making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that people who have been working to be prepared are going to be also aware of what's going on. So the information we send out is critically important, and of course the media helps us out tremendously. As you know, they're interviewing us and they're carrying the message as much as they can out to the American public.
I think we have another caller on the line.
Yes,
sure.
Mark Davis from Batavia, Illinois.
Oh, thanks for calling in, Mark.
I have a couple questions. Actually, I got one question I'd like to ask Bill, if I may.
Sure, Mark.
Being in the emerging management, myself here in Illinois, we deal directly with tornadoes and blizzards and things like that, not hurricanes as much. So I'm more on the complacency is a big issue with us in their emergency management because people, with tornadoes or anything else, nothing happened. This warning went out, nothing happened. My question has to do with last year's. You touched on it earlier in the show, last year's predictions of a very strong year with multiple hurricanes and things like that, and then the El Nino took effect. My question is, how did the El Nino creep up so fast that it completely caught everybody off guard?
Well, that's a very good question, Mark. I appreciate you asking. And incidentally, I know what you're dealing with when it comes to the tornadoes, flash floods, and severe winter storms. I used to be the executive officer for Kansas City, which had management for the National Weather Service of the whole north central part of the nation. And it's a very, very active area of severe weather that you live in. And complacency certainly is a problem that we all face, and no matter what category of types of warnings we have to issue. Is very, very important. Going back to your question here, I think it's a classic example that we don't know it all. We simply don't know it all. And what happened was that the harbingers that we have to predict the development of an El Nino was not sufficiently long-range enough to have let us know when we issued the first outlook in May that an El Nino was beginning to develop. And that's exactly what happened. We went out with the outlook based on all these other factors, warm sea surface temperatures. We went out with an El Nino, without an El Nino in that factor. And we also looked at the fact that we were in the midst of a multi-decadal period of active hurricanes and tropical storms. We just had 05 and 04. And we saw the sea surface temperatures were continuing to be warmer than average. So we had all the factors in place, we believe, for a very active season. And as the season played out, the El Nino came in, and then we began to get harbingers that an El Nino was developing. And I think at first they looked at it and they said, well, it's still weak, and we don't think that that's going to be significant. But before long, by sometime in about August 10th, El Nino was announced as being moderate, and of course by then we know that the waning of the activity of the 06 season had already been working in both July and into August, and it played out right through August into September, and August and September are two of our very busiest months, and then of course it plays out into October, another busy month. So in large part, most of the season was yet to take place when the El Nino was announced, and the El Nino had a decisive role, I believe, in waning the activity of that particular season in 06. So complacency from that concerns us, of course, Mark. And being a partner with us on this issue, we know how much we try to explain the complacency as something that's natural, but at the same time we try to fight it to make sure that people realize they may not get a chance later when the event's on top of them to do what they need to do, so we need to get it done beforehand. So we work at it together, and I appreciate your efforts.
Thank you. Just another addition to that same question. Now, did this El Nino develop faster than most other El Ninos?
In a way, I think it did. I remember that we came out, and I think I have my dates correct. We had an outlook for the season, and the outlook on August the 8th was weakened a slight bit. At that time, they felt that if we were to have this El Nino, it would be a weak El Nino and would have a minimal impact on the season. But 2 days later, the latest analysis of the sea surface temperatures, that the anomaly, that means the sea surface temperatures that were above normal in the eastern Pacific were such that the wind circulation changes that the El Nino would cause would be more significant, that the El Nino was now of moderate strength, and it would cause the shearing and the subsiding air, instead of convecting upwards air, the subsiding air over the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, that would tend to suppress the amount of hurricane and tropical storm development. And so that came out on August the 10th. And by then, of course, we still had a good portion of August and September and October still ahead of us. And all of those were influenced by the El Nino year. And
on the same token, it seemed to have weakened quicker than most El Ninos also.
Yes, and that's an interesting point, Mark. We had the significant El Nino work its way into the severe weather season, which when that happens, we have a very active severe weather season across the South. El Nino causes pretty active severe weather across the South normally when it's of moderate intensity. And so we saw, as you recall, some mid-Florida tornadoes, a rather significant, almost Midwest type of tornadoes that hit that area. In fact, they were of that strength, and then continuing on across the Southland. And now we're just seeing the signs of El Nino now weakening quite rapidly. So we feel there's always a little bit of a time lapse behind the changes in the atmosphere as far as the impacts that we're going to feel across the southern U.S. But even though we're still having severe active weather, and we will continue to do so as we get further into the spring months, we look at the El Nino as weakening, and then we're hoping that will be factored in properly, as opposed to last year, in with the outlook that we're going to have in the latter part of May for the upcoming 2007 hurricane and tropical storm season.
Well, we certainly can attest up here in the Midwest that the El Nino has weakened rapidly because normally on El Nino season we have warmer than usual temperatures, and we did have that in the beginning of the year. But as you probably are aware, later on this year, now it's snowier and colder than it was originally predicted also.
Mark, you're right on top of it, and you're exactly correct, and that's another factor that we have seen already. We got into the cold weather, and we can have an occasional cold weather spell, but we got into a real long-term cold weather spell here, and another factor was playing into that make it even stronger than what was expected and colder than what was expected. So you're right, and that has been another factor that has indicated a weakening El Nino.
You know, Bill, on the question of El Nino, with Bill Gray coming out with his forecasts every year, and he does not see, or he does predict, let's just say he does not see an El Nino coming, and he predicts a high number of named storms, or the opposite of that, he thinks an El Nino is going to form and lowers his numbers. Do you fear that that sends a message to the public that, well, maybe we don't have to be as concerned? And I know we can reference Andrew, but when people hear less numbers, and I know this happened this past year, everybody who said, oh, it's not going to be anything like 2005, it's good news, good news, good news. That's how the hurricane season started out, with all the good news. And I was concerned because I thought all it takes is one. How do you address the media with that kind of a hype about a slower season?
Jim, another very good point, and I mentioned earlier that indeed we do look at this El Nino, we use it as an important factor in the outlook, but at the same time, I mentioned earlier in the program that indeed there are other factors too that are playing out, some of which we really don't have a handle on. And so we've got to make sure that people understand that Mother Nature is a very, very complicated, three-dimensional arena that is, for this part of the world, very, very active when it comes to severe weather. We have got to be ready, in spite of what may be our best attempts to looking at the season that's upcoming and saying it's going to be an active season or a below normal season or whatever. I really am concerned that we put too much emphasis on that. So you bring up a very good point, and obviously we're all interested, so it's only natural that we put a lot of emphasis on these outlooks, but yet at the same time I hope that the emphasis doesn't carry over into causing any waning in our preparedness activities.
All right, Mark, did you have any other questions, sir?
Well, that's it. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks for calling in.
Mark, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mark is another one that might be coming down. We had a Hurricane City gathering last year up in the Panhandle, and it was to go see to get to know everybody, and also to go and look at the Katrina damage in Mississippi and Louisiana. And it looks like everybody might try to come down to South Florida this year around the conference. So maybe you'll get to meet a few of the people, and they're big fans of the work at the National Hurricane Center. So, you know what? That was going to lead into another one of my questions. What does it take to I know you have tours of the National Hurricane Center. What if somebody, well, I'll just come right out and ask you, what if a group of us want to come down there and see the Hurricane Center? What's involved with that? Do we have to, is there a chain of phone calls you have to make, or a particular protocol? Or say a group from anywhere in the country, a small group of people want to come down and see the Hurricane Center. What do they have to do?
Well, first of all, I would say that we currently have a vacant position in the public affairs officers, but a public information officer position is vacant at this time. But that doesn't mean that you can't call in and indicate an interest to come visit us, and we'll try to coordinate what would be the best time to come down based on your schedule and based on the number of visitors who we may be having on that day. And we would certainly be glad, especially when it involves a visit of partners such as you, Jim, and many of the other partners that we have out there listening to this program. But I would mention that once we start the hurricane season, it gets more difficult, just simply because the amount of media that's in the Hurricane Center, and we just have a limited space there. The Hurricane Center is totally filled with offices and operational workstations, and we have a certain amount of room that...
you don't want people in there running around turning knobs and everything while you're tracking a hurricane.
Well, certainly that, but at the same time, it's just more difficult for us to draw away from our duties to be able to spend some time with the visitors, which we would like to do. So we usually ask the visitors to understand the thrust of our mission delivery and to stay away from the hurricane season to make those requests. But we try to accommodate as many as we can outside of the hurricane season. And then, of course, as soon as we get a public affairs officer, we'll be able to even coordinate these requests even better. But in the meantime, I would suggest that you call us at the Hurricane Center when you may be interested in coming down and with your group, and then we'll begin the process from there.
Okay, now I think we have another caller on the line.
Hi, Jim. It's Bill from Virginia Beach. How you doing?
Good, Bill.
One question, shifting gears, and it's an honor to talk to you, Director Proenza. These tropical weather outlooks over the last few years, they seem to be all over the map. There's a lot of discrepancy in them. 1 minute, you'll read one outlook at 5:30 in the morning, and they'll say tropical storm development is not expected through Saturday. And then at 11:30, they're sending a plane out to investigate an area. This is the same day, mind you. What do you plan to do to bring some stability to the issuance of some of the tropical weather products? And I'll take my question off air. And thanks for taking my question. And thank you, Jim.
All right, Bill.
Thank you very much for calling. That's a good question, and the tropical weather outlooks are produced 4 times a day, and they're updated. The reason they're produced 4 times a day, because the Caribbean activity, it can be that changeable. It can be that active sometimes, and development can be very, very quick. And so we're watching it all the time based on the analysis that we do out over the ocean. We're able to get an assessment of what the conditions of the atmosphere are. But at the same time, we don't have a capability to sense all areas of the ocean and the atmosphere above the ocean to know what every parcel of air may be doing and what are the conditions and what may be developing. We do the best that we can with the technology and the science that we have, but we also admit to the fact that there's a limitation to our capabilities, and what we want to do is not sacrifice the services that we're providing all of you. And so if that means that in the next tropical weather outlook we have to change it and update it because an area of activity has begun to develop, or we're sending an aircraft out there because we've been watching an area of activity that looked like it wasn't doing anything and all of a sudden it's taken a turn towards intensity, well, we will do whatever we can to send a plane out there and get the very latest information. We're not so proud that we can't admit to our mistakes, too.
So you don't have somebody coming in there, another forecaster taking over for the previous shift, and slap the guy in the back of the head and go, "What's the matter with you? Didn't you see that thing forming?" You don't have that kind of thing going on.
No, we don't. Not that I've seen yet. But I will say we have quite a great group of experts in the field of tropical weather, and they really work together very, very well. We get a lot of help and support also from other scientists and forecasters in the Navy and in the Air Force and in some of the other nations that are involved that monitor the conditions around their areas and their nation. And it's quite an effort. It's quite a team effort, and that's why it involves the World Meteorological Organization all working together to try to bring the best possible information and eventually warnings out to the public that may be impacted. Hence, we have our, as I mentioned earlier in the program, our World Meteorological Organization annual coordination meeting that we have coming up, which will take place in Curacao. And in it, we will coordinate all of the various issues, operational as well as problematic issues, and trying to make sure that we can do everything we can to make our services even more effective.
Do you make that a family affair when you go to places like that, or you go alone?
Well, it's interesting as it stands right now for me. All of my kids are grown and out of the house, so that makes it easier. And I'm divorced, so it's not like a problem that I have to take anybody along with me. But I will say this: the job is 24/7, and I have, especially when we're involved in these types of coordination meetings, it is really busy time. So we work very hard, and then we've got to run back and get back to the preparedness activities that we're doing as well, as far as nationally.
All right, Bill. I got just two email questions, and I'm going to let you go. I appreciate all the time you spent tonight here. This is from Casey in Massachusetts. He wants to know, in a nutshell, we touched on this earlier in the interview, but how do you become a forecaster at the National Hurricane Center? What's the best avenue for a young kid to become a forecaster at the National Hurricane Center?
Excellent question. Of course, all of our people that we have in the forecaster position, the hurricane specialist position, whether they're senior hurricane specialists or hurricane specialists working towards the seniority of the responsibility of being ultimately responsible for the hurricane decisions and forecasts, all of those people have gone through a formal education process at an accredited university in atmospheric physics. They have become meteorologists studying the field of meteorology, which is in large part physics and mathematics, looking at the equations of motions of the atmosphere, looking at all the principles of physics and thermodynamics, and bringing all that together with a handle on how we can convey that and use that information mathematically towards models and insight into how the atmosphere functions, how the atmosphere works, to make these incredible convective machines happen. And that's what they are. These hurricanes are Mother Nature's convective machines that distribute its unequal heating from the equator out towards the poles. And it's a very effective way that the Earth has to do that. But forecasting it requires as much as we can bring to the fold at this time the technology and the science that we have in the field of meteorology towards getting an understanding of what's happening out there. And keep in mind that we don't have a complete view of the atmosphere. We may have one that we can visually look down on, but as far as the values of the various parcels of air and what have you, we have to sort of estimate what they're going to be because we don't have readings everywhere. So we try to do the best job we can, and then we model that. And we use a lot of models from all around the world, and they help us towards a greater understanding of the processes that go into hurricanes and their development.
So basically,
hopefully that helps, because the field of meteorology is a field that you find in the accredited universities across the nation, and there's universities providing that sort of training all over. NYU is one up in that neck of the woods, and also MIT, and there are many others up there, Penn State, and of course they're spread across the nation too. All over the nation we have great schools teaching meteorology.
Yeah, I know Eric Blake came from Colorado State, where working with Bill Gray before he went to the National Hurricane Center. But is it reasonable to expect a young person to come out of college, go right to NHC, or is that pretty unusual? They usually go have another stop off, maybe at a local weather service office somewhere.
Well, that's another good question. Obviously, people who are willing to move and broaden their experience base as much as they can are usually in the best position to bring more to the table when they're applying for an opening at the Hurricane Center. But we've had people who have started their career at the Hurricane Center and spent their entire careers there and done a fantastic job. So it just depends on the individual, but any of those approaches do work. And again, as I mentioned, an approach coming in from the National Weather Service, other forecast offices, and then transferring into the Hurricane Center, which is also part of the National Weather Service, is all part of one big family. And at the same time, is also an opportunity there for everyone to bid on these jobs that they most desire.
All right, Bill, one final email question, and then we're going to let you go. The phone lines are cut off, so nobody else call in. This is from Linda in Las Vegas. She always listens to these weather shows. She has friends over here in the hurricane zone. She asked, first of all, she said, great job at the Hurricane Center, and she asked if the government's officials are taking things more seriously now since Katrina, and are there other worst-case scenarios still lurking, and do you think things will be different? And what's the worst-case scenario, and what do you think about the government officials picking it up since Katrina?
Well, I think that even before Katrina, we've had government officials very actively involved. And I mean by that not only local government, but also state and national government. Everybody has been very much involved and supportive when it comes to these major threats on life, and especially in the United States where we have such active weather. It has not been a problem in that arena for us at all. What we face, of course, is that in times of diminishing tax dollars, we're certainly struggling, like any other federal agency, to compete for the tax dollars that we help will yield great benefit to the nation. And we feel that we bring a great benefit in the part from the National Weather Service through its National Hurricane Center and its forecast offices and river forecast centers to the American people, because we do use those tax dollars to the maximum benefit that they can be used for in order to meet that highest calling there is, which is the protection of life for any government. And we're so appreciative to have the opportunity to be part of that team to provide that sort of critical service to this part of the world. And again, as I mentioned earlier, part of the world that has some of the world's most active and severe weather. I really appreciate Linda's call and question from Las Vegas. It's really gratifying to know that people are sensitive to the fact that government is very important to us in the future of programs such as the National Weather Service and its mission to protect life.
You know, Bill, I'm amazed as each year passes how many people are interested in watching and tracking hurricanes that are not even in the hurricane zones. You got people all over the country, and in Europe especially, in the UK, in Germany, places like that are watching this stuff going down, and they're fascinated by it. And your word reaches not maybe with as much importance overseas, but I mean people all over the world are watching you when you're being in front of that camera. It's really an unbelievable event when a hurricane is approaching the United States. It really has the world's eyes on it, and see how we handle it. And I'm sure that you're going to be fantastic. I have no doubt about that. You're very knowledgeable, and like I started the show, you're a good dresser. I don't know if it's you or Chris Lancey that's the better dresser over there, but you guys always sporting your suits and looking real nice, you know. But I'm looking forward to seeing you in front of the camera this year and seeing how you perform down at the National Hurricane Center, and we'll catch you at the conference down in Fort Lauderdale.
Jim, I look forward to that, and I so much appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight here and your folks listening to your program across the nation. It's a great partnership we have, and I appreciate so much this open forum.
Oh, and also William Wagner said to say hello at Early Alert, him and Billy Wagner.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they're supporters of Hurricane City, and they said to say hello.
They're dear friends, and I appreciate them so much. They're part of that emergency management community that we so much depend on.
Yep, I know Billy will be down there a lot probably. Looking over your shoulders. Yeah, that's what he likes to do. He's pretty good at it.
Well, we're always glad to see him.
All right, Bill. Well, you have a good night, and we'll catch up with you at the conference. And again, good luck this year, and we'll be rooting for you over there at Hurricane Center.
Thank you so very much, Jim. Take care and good night.
Okay, good night, Bill.